If you're playing the Sicilian defense yourself, or if you're playing against it, then you need to know these 5 lines, how you can crush different common lines of the Sicilian defense. So there we go with the first variation of the Sicilian defense. These are the most popular moves, I think, of all, or at least one of them. And here if black goes pawn to g6, going into the so-called dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, there is a really interesting move pawn to f4, known as Levenfish variation. This move, which looks like just normal development moves, which maybe tries to get control over some central squares, in reality sets a very clever trap. If black continues with their plan, which they started by playing pawn to g6, preparing to fianchetto their bishop, then all of a sudden you can kick off an early attack in the center by playing pawn to e5. And if your opponent is unprepared, they're likely to trade pawns here and jump with their knight to g4, as it looks like the white's attack is premature, and now white will suffer because black is simply gonna take this pawn on the next move. But after that, it's actually a losing mistake, and after bishop b5, all of a sudden black realizes that things aren't that easy for them. How can they cover their king from this check? They can't cover it with a knight, as this square is attacked by the white's pieces 2 times, and therefore you'll simply grab it and win material. Covering the king by the bishop is not an option either, as in this case white can simply win the knight on g4, taking advantage of the pin along this diagonal, and therefore black cannot recapture. After calculating these lines, let's take a move back, black realizes that okay, I can't cover, I gotta move. And once they go king to f8, there is another killer, a more sudden move, knight to e6, with the discovered attack to the black's queen and check to the king. Therefore, after black takes the knight, you just take the queen, not only winning the queen, but it's just a checkmate. While the trap has been there for a long time, just look at this. Look at the statistics. I've opened the database of chess games, and look at this. The top move of black is bishop to g7, then you go pawn to e5. The top move by far is trading pawns there, and once again the most common move is knight to g4 or knight to d5, which is also a bad option, but knight g4 fails to bishop b5, and then they go king f8 right into the trap, knight to e6. If you want to know more about this line, I've got a dedicated video about this variation against the Sicilian defense. You can check this out by clicking the link in the description. There we go with the second line. In this case, we are going to be analyzing the so-called Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian defense, also widely popular nowadays, where black goes pawn to e5. This is a more aggressive setup for black. They are willing to weaken their position in the center a little bit for the sake of quick development and for the initiative, of course. That's why many players love it so much. Here, after you jump with your knight to b5 and they play pawn to d6 to cover this weakness, there is a really interesting line here that you can get into. Instead of playing the major move bishop to g5, the main line, you can go knight to d5. After that, you're creating an obvious threat of jumping with one of your knights to c7 with a fork to the black's king and rook. Therefore, your opponent will trade knights here on d5. Now you're attacking the knight, therefore it has to go, and then you play pawn to c4. Again, this is kind of a hidden trap, because pawn to c4 looks like you're just providing some additional protection for the pawn and maybe just want to get some control in the center of squares. But if they play pawn to a6, trying to push your knight away, all of a sudden it turns out that the move c4 also had one more hidden idea behind it. It is the move queen to a4. Your queen from here takes aim at the black's king, and it is indeed a very dangerous threat. By the way, of course, I gotta mention that black can't just take your knight here on b5 as the pawn is pinned, and in this case you will win the exchange, you'll grab the rook on a8. Very often your opponents at this point will think, okay, if the major threat that I've got here is just to cover these diagonals so that the queen cannot, deliver this discovered check, then I just gotta play bishop d7 and simply cover it, and I'm doing fine. And I've checked the database, it's actually the second most played move here, where black goes bishop d7 thinking that they're doing fine. But of course at this point you're afraid to say this, and to finish it off by playing knight takes d6 checkmate. The next trap, which works against any line of the Sicilian defense, is my favorite. Here after black goes pawn to c5, you play pawn to a3. And it is hard to believe that such a weird looking move, which seems meaningless, is in fact a really evil trap. let's get right into it. So black goes knight to c6, thinking, okay, if he wants to play b4, let me stop it. But you go there anyway, and after an exchange of pawns, black take the pawn here on b4, thinking that they're facing a complete amateur who is just playing random moves and blundering pawns. Then you play pawn to d4 or pawn to c3. Both moves are fine, they usually lead to the same position. Then black will go pawn to d5, you play pawn to c3, attacking this knight. Once it goes back, you take here on d5, black recaptures, and then you play knight a3, another weird looking move. And once your opponent is completely convinced that you are just a very beginner player, in fact, at this position I would say that black's position is highly dangerous. It is almost losing in a real practical game if black is not prepared. I've got also a dedicated video about this opening variation, I'll link it down, where I analyze different lines. In this case, let's just take a look at one of the examples where black played pawn to e5. An aggressive move which is completely wrong in this position, because white's move knight to a3 prepared the jump of the knight to b5. And from here the knight is ready to jump to c7 and attack the black's king, queen and rook simultaneously, so that would be a really deadly fork. All of a sudden black can't really stop it from happening. The only way to stop it from happening immediately is to jump with your queen back, but then you start pushing your pawn forward, d5, attacking the knight. Once it goes away somewhere, it doesn't matter, you play pawn to d6, which, totally restricts the black's pieces here. The bishop can't come out anymore, but even more so, it renews the threat of knight going to c7 with check. If black desperately tries to cover it, then you're willing to sacrifice the exchange here, because after that, you're gonna get a lot more. Then you go knight to c7 check, king has to move, and at this position, you can just grab the rook, and this is winning. You've got other moves as well. In this game, they played bishop to a3, which is also one of the winning continuations. White is trying to keep this structure in the center of the board around the black's king to ensure that they can create this checkmating net around black's king. Black played bishop b7 in the game, white continued queen g4, it's actually already a forcing checkmate. King goes to c6, queen a4, king b6, and after a little bit dancing back and forth, white checkmated the black's king like this. It's interesting that the black player in this game was a Grandmaster, and it was a 3-minute blitz game, so fairly standard time control for blitz games nowadays. You can just see how dangerous this opening weapon is, that even a Grandmaster can lose that badly. The next game happened between Bartel against Gasik, and black chosen to use an old style move knight to f6. It's an old move, it was played by Nimzovitch and other famous players of the past, Rubinstein to name a few, and actually the move is not bad, even though nowadays other lines are more popular. Anyway, let's see what you can do here. First white played knight c3 just to protect the pawn on e4, black goes pawn on d5, pawn takes, knight takes. At this point it seems that black is doing absolutely fine and they just equalize, they have no problems, but it's not that simple. You go bishop b5 check, and after they cover you continue with knight to e5, and you start putting some pressure onto the black's position. Here you are somewhat attacking this knight, putting pressure onto the bishop on d7, and black decided to simplify the position and to trade off the knights. The very natural looking move all of a sudden turns out to be a deadly mistake. Instead of recapturing one of the black's pieces, white just plays queen f3, and he says, hey, I'm not interested in these minor things, I just want to checkmate black. Black played f6, because what else? And then queen h5. Now with the right hook, we are still getting to the black's king. The only way to cover is g6, but then you just break through with knight takes g6. It's quite clear that if black decides to take here, then just simply queen takes g6, it's a checkmate, fairly nice. Let's take a move back. In the game, black decided to take on b5, hoping that that'll win material and provide black with an escape path, but white just locked it down with the move knight to e5, and this is once again a checkmate. And the final game for today happens in the closed variation of the Sicilian defense, which is also a pretty good opening weapon. Here white opted for f4, black responded with pawn on d6, knight f3, bishop g4. I'd like to show you this game because many of your opponents really love this kind of a pin against your knight, thinking that in the future they can bring up the knight here on d4 and create some problems for you. So let's see how you can handle that. White played bishop c4 first of all. This actually already creates a threat. Let me just show you. Let's say if I play any random move for black, the threat is actually bishop takes f7 followed by knight g5. It didn't happen in the game, just want to show you this common tactical pattern. Because of the check, black has to move and then you grab the bishop on g4, winning a pawn and exposing the black's king. So bishop c4 already creates some problems for black. Anyway, let's take a move back. In the game, black played a more normal move, of course, pawn to e5, trying to get control over the center squares. It was probably more prudent to put the pawn on e6 to restrict the bishop of c4, but black at this point was optimistic, thinking that there was nothing to worry about. White simply castled, and black continued their plan with knight to d4. So again, they're playing fairly aggressively, and I'd like to ask you to think about this and to write it down in the comments below if you can find the right continuation for white here. It's a common tactical idea, and it would be interesting whether you can find it or not. Thank you very much for watching, best of luck in your chess battles, and don't forget to give a like to this video if you enjoyed it and want me to cover the Sicilian defense more.